Okay, so I was telling you last time that perhaps one of the most famous passages in all philosophy is the allegory of the cave from Book 7 of Plato's Republic. And let's reconstruct the dramatic context from which so we can interpret this properly. So by the time you get to the end of Book 6 of the Republic, we've reached the point where Socrates has gotten everyone to accept the fact that there needs to be the wisest and the most virtuous people who are ruling this ideal city-state, this ideal republic. And since philosophers take wisdom as their ultimate concern, in fact, the very word philosophy means the love of wisdom, that he claims that philosophers need to be rulers of the state. So now they're talking about the education of the philosophy rulers. The philosophy rulers. And the Greek word for education is paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A. But I was telling you that if you think in a certain way, in terms of Plato's view of human nature, you can think about human nature in Plato as an educational process. So human nature for Plato has within it the capacity to elevate itself. I'm using the word evolution, which is not a very Platonic word. Plato never used the word evolution, which is more of a modern word. But there are stages towards the development of human nature, towards what Plato would call a true human being. And so what he asks us to do is take what he had just been talking about in book 6, namely the divided line, which I went over with you, and use that as an interpretive key, as a master key to interpret this allegory. Now, there's a lot more to the allegory of the cave than there is to the divided line, but the two together provide a full disclosure of what Plato means by paideia, by education. The education of the people who will be entrusted making decisions for the well-being of the populace. But there's more to the allegory of the cave than there is in the divided line. So the divided line is a purely conceptual expression of the stages of development of a human being. But the allegory of the cave takes that and fills it in with imagery that needs to be interpreted. Now, what Plato does is he begins to interpret the allegory himself using Socrates to interpret. And then he wants the reader to continue with the interpretation. He wants us to interpret. So how do we interpret? Well, I told you the first stage of philosophical understanding is the philological moment. So what you try to do is get as close as you can to the author's intention, okay? It's impossible to reconstruct that intention completely. We'd have to become Plato, which is impossible. But we can make an effort to get us in the neighborhood, in the vicinity of the intention of Plato. Now, that's not easy because Plato wrote these dialogues, and Socrates is talking with these people. In this case, he's just talking with Glaucon, which in real life is Plato's brother, and they're discussing the education of the philosopher rulers. I'm suggesting that this education reveals the actual stages of development of human nature toward wisdom. As I was saying last time, a transformation of the soul towards wisdom and moral excellence, or arete. So there's a lot more to the allegory of the cave than there is to the divided line, but we can use the line, the divided line, to help us interpret. In fact, it fits very perfectly. Now, there's something in the text itself that invites us to do that, because Glaucon says, or Socrates tells Glaucon, we can just take what we were just saying before, he says this in book 7, to to interpret what we're saying now about the allegory of the cave. So whenever I come upon an allegory is different from a purely conceptual expression. Purely conceptual are abstract ideas. Like Achilles is not an idea, but it's an image. But courage is an idea. So there's a difference between courage and Achilles. Courage is an abstract concept. And of course, it's real, depending on whether or not people embody that in their life. But in and of itself, the word courage is a concept. But if you read Homer's Iliad and you encounter Achilles, he's the valor of all valiant men. He is courage incarnate. So he's an image. Or Romeo and Juliet, that's an image. But the concept of romantic love, that's a concept. So Plato is at home both in the image and the concept. And he produces allegories, myths, but he's always doing that in order to reveal some conceptual point that he wants to make. So after having laid out the stages of the development of a human being, or the stages of education, of genuine education, in the divided line, at the beginning of book 7, he has Socrates present to Glaucon, and of course to us as the reader, this famous allegory of the cave. Whenever I come upon an allegory, then, what I do is lay out all the imagery and the action, and then I set out to interpret. And like I was telling you before, the way I approach Plato is to interpret Plato on his own terms. And so I go to other dialogues and let those dialogues shed light on the text that I'm trying to interpret. Like I was saying last time, I'm taking liberties here to read into the text ideas that are not my own, but ideas that are Plato's that come from other places. But Plato has Socrates himself interpret the beginnings of the allegory of the cave, and then he wants the reader to continue. So what is this allegory of the cave? Well, he wants you to envision this underground cave. And in this, so that's one thing that's important to interpret. I'll lay out all the elements of the allegory and the action, and then we can set out to interpret. So the big thing is there's this cave underground, and there are these prisoners in the cave. And the prisoners are there from a very young age or from birth. And they're shackled by their arms, their legs, and their neck, and they can only see forward. They can't see three things. They can't see themselves, they can't see their neighbors, and they can't see around them. They don't know they can't see behind them or along the side. They can only look forward, and they see the cave wall. Now, behind the prisoners is a raised platform. Plato has Socrates say, the kind that puppeteers use. So maybe the notion of puppets, marionettes plays a part in the interpretation. But let's wait. I'll hold back the interpretation, just lay out all the elements first. So there's this raised platform, the kind puppeteers use, and there are these men. Now, they're still in the cave, but they're not shackled. They're walking back and forth on this raised platform, and they're carrying statues of man-made things and statues of natural things, which is the whole material world. Everything in the material world is either natural or man-made. They're carrying these statues and they're talking. Now, since they're talking, their voices are bouncing off the cave wall and creating echoes. All these things I'm saying are important elements to be interpreted. The things they're carrying, the men, the raised platform, the prisoners, the prison itself, the cave wall, the echoes. Now, behind the raised platform is a big fire burning. And that fire is casting light, like all fires do, on these men who are carrying things back and forth. And that light then is creating shadows, because the men are blocking the light, and it's creating shadows on the cave wall. Now, there's this important delusion going on among the prisoners. The prisoners think that those shadows are real people and that these people are talking but the reader knows, Plato knows, Glaucon knows, we all know, but the people, it's sort of like a film, sometimes the characters in the film don't know as much as the audience does, or the director, or the people, the writer, right? So we know that these are echoes and shadows because we can see the big picture. But the prisoners, they can't see that. So they think the shadows are real and they think the shadows are talking. And there's a little bit of an action going on here. They're playing a game of who can discern the patterns on the cave wall the best. And the ones who are best at that are given honor for that, okay, for guessing and divining the pattern. So all these things I'm saying are elements that need to be interpreted. Well, the big action then is somebody comes into the cave, and Plato doesn't have Socrates tell Glaucon who this person is or why they came down the cave. They come down and they release one prisoner. They don't release everybody, that's important. He releases one prisoner. Now, Plato makes a big deal, or Socrates is doing all the talking, but Plato wrote the dialogue. But Plato has Socrates make a big deal about the fact that this prisoner that's being released by this other person who came down into the cave, he puts up a big resistance, and Plato makes a big deal about that. So we need to think about that. What's the meaning of this resistance? Why does he not want to leave the cave? But there's a struggle, and the person who's liberating this person, this prisoner, finally wins out, and the released prisoner acquiesces, and they make their way out. He shows him, look, these are shadows. These are echoes, and these are things that are the shadows of these men and these things these statues that they're carrying. And look, this is a fire. That's what's creating the shadows. And they make their way up the long, steep upward climb. The long, steep upward climb. Now, medicine was advanced enough and physical science was advanced enough in ancient Greece for people like Plato to know that the eyes need time to acclimate if you go from darkness to light. They knew that the pupils of the eye dilate, and that if you're in the dark, the pupils get small because they let in less light. And when you go from darkness to light, it takes a little time for the pupils to dilate, and then it needs to, that's why when you go from darkness to light, it's hard to see at first because it's too bright. And after a while, your pupils get smaller and they let in less light, and then they acclimate. The word is acclimate. So he makes a big deal about the eyes needing time to acclimate. So it's a long, steep upward climb, and it takes a long time. Now, since the eyes need to acclimate, that means that he could see better in the dark than he can in the light. But the things he sees on the surface, by the time they get to the surface of the earth and they see the trees and the plants and the animals and humans and all the things on the surface of the earth, he can't see that very well because his eyes need time. But after a while, the pupils get smaller and let in less light, and he can see better, and his eyes have acclimated, and he sees the things on the surface of the earth. And then as time goes by, he looks up and he sees the sky and the luminaries of the sky. What are up in the sky? The moon, the stars, the fixed stars, the planets, and the heavenly bodies. And now, the other thing that an allegory can bring out that purely conceptual speech can't do is to bring out the emotional element, the passions. So Plato wants us to feel how it might feel to be liberated from this cave of delusion and bondage, and to make your way out, how it must feel, how my former life must have felt. And he feels this sense of awe this joy in being released. And there's this sense of ecstasy and joy in feeling liberated and seeing reality. Now, they make their way even further, and they begin to get to the pinnacle of the earth. And he notices the sun. But he can't look at the sun because it's too bright. As everyone knows, it's too bright to look at the sun. So the only way you can see the sun is reflecting in shiny surfaces like water or any shiny surface, or when it reflects off the atmosphere in the morning or in the evening. You can see it, but through the haze of the atmosphere. But one day he looks at the sun and he feels this incredible sense of astonishment, thavmazi, T-H-A-U-M-A-Z-E-I-N, is the Greek word for astonishment. He's astonished. At what? At the sun, and how the sun brings into vision everything, from darkness to light. Well, he lives up there for a long time, but he feels so overfull with the feelings of freedom and saturated by his apprehension of reality, he wants to go back. He feels a sense of obligation to his fellow prisoners. So he makes his way down the cave again, and he tries to become the occasion for the liberation of others. Now here, Plato has Socrates express another sentiment that's important, I think. And that is, he risks going back down knowing full well that if these men could get their hands free, they would kill the man who tries to set him free. Okay? They feel this animosity toward the liberator. Just like at first, the person who was liberated felt this reluctance to be liberated. They would kill the man who tries to set them free, Plato says. If, for example, he begins to speak about justice in courts of law where they can see only the shadows of justice. See, this tells me he has Socrates. Plato has Socrates in mind because, as I told you, Plato knew that his great teacher Socrates was executed in 399 BC and defended himself in court and spoke of justice in court among an oligarchy who could know only the shadows of justice. So he risks all that, this fictitious character that comes back down into the cave. Now, who is this character? Let's not lose the plot here. It's not much of a plot, but it's the liberated prisoner who has now become a liberator himself. So he himself becomes a liberator, and he finds those who have an inclination to leave, and he takes them out. There's one more thing that perhaps needs to be interpreted. Plato has Socrates say to Glaucon, do you think then when this prisoner goes back down into the cave after having been liberated, that he would want to take up his place again and live like he lived before? Or would he rather be a slave to a portionless man than to opine as he did before? See, those are very carefully chosen words. I'd rather be a slave, which is the lowest of the low in ancient Greece, to somebody who has nothing, a portionless man, rather than to opine, a very carefully chosen word, doxa, remember, which means opinion, rather than to opine as he did before. In other words, I'd rather be a slave to somebody who has nothing than to live like I lived before. The unexamined life is not worth living, Socrates once said, is famous for having said. If I have to live my life and not examine life and not live philosophically, that's no human life. That's no truly human life. Those are famous words by Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. And Plato says it in different words there. he has Socrates tell Glaucon, do you think he'd like to, it's a rhetorical question, it's not really a question. Do you think he'd like to take up his place like he did before, or would he rather, you know, be a slave to a portionless man than to opine as he did before? In other words, I can't be the person I was before. There's the transformation in human nature. All right, so I'm drifting into the interpretation a little bit now, and I was deliberately trying not to interpret, just to keep it clean. So those are all the, I think, all the major elements and of the allegory and the major action. Now, what's it all mean? Well, part of it, we don't have to speculate because Plato has Socrates begin the interpretation himself. And what it means is, well, it starts this way. Glaucon says, well, strange prisoners. The word strange is philosophically intriguing to me also. If you think about strange, you know, oftentimes when we live philosophically, things that seem so obvious and so commonplace, so canny, become uncanny. They become strange. Something becomes strange that wasn't strange before, in a good sense of the word. So strange prisoners, he says, in a strange prison you're talking about. Strange indeed, Socrates says, but like us. So now here comes the interpretation. So here's my interpretation after all these years of interpreting in the light of Plato's own dialogues. But Plato gives us room to interpret, but he doesn't want us just to say anything. I mean, not all interpretations are of our equal worth. I mean, there's not just one interpretation. Philosophy, especially artful philosophy like this, the more artful it becomes, the more freedom we have to interpret, because art never has one meaning. Anybody that thinks the work of art means only this doesn't understand art. As soon as you hear that. So art, you know, gives itself to many interpretations, but that doesn't mean that all interpretations are of equal worth. So when it comes to doing good philology in philosophy, that means you try to get as close to the intention of the author as you can. So how to do that? Well, the more you study Plato, the more you understand what he's trying to express indirectly in his dialogue form, and you come into the vicinity of what he wants to express. You could never say Plato said this or that. I never say Plato says anything. I always say, as Plato has Socrates say, or as Socrates says, or as somebody says. By the way, when you're quoting Plato, we need to talk about that too, how to quote Plato, because you're going to be asked to make quotations. You're quoting Plato. As soon as you quote anything in the dialogue, it's Plato who wrote it. But you always have to say who's speaking, okay? And you have to reconstruct the context and interpret the meaning. You can't reduce, I think I mentioned this already, you can't take something somebody said and say that's what Plato said or Plato meant. But you can quote Plato to express an idea that you want to express that you think Plato is articulating. We'll talk more about that more carefully later. So let's go back and let me offer my interpretation of this. The cave, I mean, and there's room for interpretation here. You could use different words and you can say different things. But for now, just take my interpretation. And then as time goes by, then you can drift from that, as long as you're drifting in the direction of Plato's own intentions by looking at other dialogues and other parts of even this great book, The Republic. So the cave represents the world, the way I see it. But the world as seen through the viewpoint of those people who are not living philosophically. There's a Greek word that's come into our English language. It's called hoi polloi, H-O-I-P-O-L-L-O-I. It's an ancient Greek word. You know, we have a lot of words in our English language that come from foreign places. So we have French, many, I think 30% of the English words are French. The grammar comes from Germany and so on. So we have, but hoi polloi means the masses, the populace. But for Plato, it means all those people who are not living philosophically. There's like two basic ways of living in the world. There's all kinds of ways of being in the world, obviously, but one could make two crude categories. One is the everyday way of being in the world, and simply appropriating the values and concepts and opinions and viewpoint of the masses. We sort of assimilate that just by being born at a particular time, particular place. That's the everyday way of being in the world. So if money's really the main thing in life, in an extreme capitalist state, then money becomes your main goal. You know, people just assimilate like osmosis, the values and opinions and conceptions that happen to be predominant whenever they happen to be born. That's the everyday way of being in the world. Then there's this philosophical way where people, a few people, not many, even in ancient Greece, the ancient Greeks engaged in philosophy more fully than any people ever. Even there, the philosopher was an exception. So there's this philosophical way of being in the world where one raises to consciousness certain principles and tries to take their life and take possession of their own life and to live in possession of their own self, live deliberately and governing their own self instead of being governed by the opinions and viewpoints that happen to be predominant in the time when they were living. So there's this. So the cave represents the world. The prisoners in the cave represent the hoi polloi, or the masses. So what about the fact that they can't see themselves, they can't see their neighbor, and they can't see what's going on because they're shackled? I take this to mean not seeing yourself. See, seeing in Plato is always seeing with your mind's eye, unless he tells you he's talking about real vision, like seeing things. Seeing is a metaphor for Plato always, unless he says otherwise, of seeing with your mind's eye, your mind. So they can't see themselves. That means they don't understand what it means to be human because they are humans. So there's this blindness about what it means to be human. Also, they don't know their own. When you talk about self-knowledge, you can talk about universally, like what it means to be a human being, which is the subject matter of this course. But also there's another way of approaching it. What, in terms of singularity, instead of universality, we're talking about singularity. How am I different from all other human beings? What is my trajectory through life? My singular goal in life, my trajectory? What matters most to me? What is my ultimate concern? What is my singularity? So I take it in both senses of the word. They're blind to what it means to be human in the universal sense. They're blind to their own individuality. They can't see their neighbor. What I take that to mean is their relationships are external relationships. They're not deep, intimate relationships. They're external. And they don't see what's going on. Well, that's the big point. They lack circumspection. They can't see around. They don't see reality. Now, so that's what I take those three things to mean. But the big point is that they're living in bondage. That's a very extreme. They're in a cave and they're shackled. So now the point is they don't know. This is very important, actually. They don't know that they're prisoners, okay? So you can't not be a prisoner. You can't take the first steps to becoming liberated if you don't even know you're a prisoner, right? That's why Plato has the prisoners be there from birth or from an early age. They don't know any other world. So what about the echoes and the shadows? Well, what is a shadow? It's a kind of crude copy of something. It's a copy of something. And what is an echo? Well, it looks like it's coming from one place, but it's really coming from somewhere else. So they think these shadows, which are really copies of something, are speaking, but they're really hearing echoes. It's an echo of something that somebody else said. Now, what could this mean? Well, you have to think. Plato wants us to think. That's why he's being so cryptic here. He didn't interpret. He wants us to interpret. But he doesn't want us just to read anything into it. He wants us to get close to his own intentions and then interpret it in that light. Well, what that means is that these people who are living, these masses of people who are living unphilosophically, when they hear people talk, they don't know if that talk comes from a real deep understanding of the subject matter, or if those things that people are saying are just being echoed from somebody else, some opinion maker, somebody else that has said it. They don't know the difference. Like if you haven't seen gold, then you don't know if this is fool's gold. The only way you know this is pyrite or fool's gold is to have seen gold. So if you've never seen gold, then you don't know if this is fool's gold or gold. That's my point, is that these prisoners, since they've never seen reality, they don't know reality when they see it. So they're easily duped. They can fall prey to propaganda and so on. But before we move on, you need to always remind yourself that none of this stuff exists, right? There's no cave, there's no prisoners, nothing. It's all a big farce. But if you can interpret it, it reveals reality in a deep way, in ways that are different from even science or history, because it's revealing something universal about the human condition, about reality, and about what it means to be human. Okay, so that's the shadows and the echoes. Now, what are the shadows and echoes of? It's of those people who are carrying things back and forth. They're carrying those statues. So what are the statues? Well, let's go back to the divided line. There are 4 levels of the divided line. Remember, 4 powers of the soul that reveal 4 levels of reality. Each higher level is more real and more true. Well, the first level, imagining that reveals the image, that represents the apprehension of the way that these prisoners are seeing reality, because they're seeing copies of things. So the first level of the divided line should be connected to the cave wall and the echoes and the shadows and what's going on in the mind of the prisoners. Okay, that's level 1. Level 2, which in the divided line was sense perception. What does sense perception reveal? The sensible particular. Remember I said that. Well, those things that the men are carrying on that raised platform are statues. Now, why does Plato use the word, have them carrying statues? A statue is a copy of something. Like this is a statue of an elephant, raised with his raised trunk, which is showing his power and it's auspicious. But it's not an elephant, right? It's a copy of an elephant. So they're carrying statues because for Plato, the material world is a copy of the idea. So the real elephant, of which this is a copy, for Plato is a copy of the idea of elephant. That's why he has these men carrying statues of man-made things and of natural things. Okay, so those things they're carrying represent the material world. And those men, well, they're in the cave, so they're not free. They're not on the surface of the earth, but they're not shackled either. Those are the opinion makers. We used to use the expression opinion makers. And I think that's a good locution for Plato because he makes a big distinction between doxa, opinion, doxa, and episteme, which is knowledge. So these are the opinion makers. The values, the convictions, the ideas that happen to be predominant when anyone happens to be born, and how people just assimilate it like osmosis. Okay, so the fire must represent then the sun, because the sun makes visible the material world. And so the fire in the allegory of the cave represents the physical sun, which is the hub of nature. Now, what about this man who comes down into the cave? Who's that? Well, before we go into that, there's one little more thing I wanted to pick up. The fact that they're playing this game and giving honor to the person who can best discern the patterns on the cave wall. I think what that represents is the topsy-turviness of the values of the prisoners, of the populace, the masses. What's really important for Plato is the well-being of your soul and the well-being of the soul of the commonwealth, of the state, of the people. That's what's important. But what we do, living this everyday way of being in the world as prisoners in the cave, we take what's peripheral, like money, like physical pleasure, like honor, and we put that at the center of our lives. Then we take what's central, we put it on the periphery, put it on the back, and don't even think about it. What is central is the well-being of our soul, wisdom, the movement towards wisdom and moral excellence, and the attainment of well-being. That's what's important. But that's not what people are polishing. They're polishing their cars, they're living in the material world mostly. So there's this topsy-turviness of values. Philosophers are the legislators of value, Nietzsche once said. And I find that to be, they're the ones that try to tell us what's important and what's not so important. So Socrates says that I'm taking that from Plato, in the one dialogue called The Apology. Socrates says, gentlemen, when he's defending himself in court, all I'm doing is taking what's central, putting it at the center of my life. What's peripheral, I put it on the periphery. But most people take peripheral things, they make it central. They take central things, they put it on the periphery. So that's that game they're playing. They're giving honor to the people who can guess the movement of the shadows. The man who comes in is the liberator, the teacher, who finds it, the activist who's also a teacher, who comes down and tries to become the occasion for the liberation of others, the educator who's an activist and spiritually developed. It's the philosopher, or any person. It doesn't have to be a professional philosopher, but anybody who takes wisdom as their vocation. So he comes back down, he liberates one of the prisoners, they resist. That resistance is the movement out of the comfort zone. People find it comforting and comfort in living in this prison. But finally he acquiesces. They make their way up the long, steep upward climb. But that long, steep upward climb, that's paideia. That's the evolution of the human soul. That's the movement, the elevation of human nature. And there's evoking then a transformation and a liberation of human nature. Now, the things on the surface of the earth, that represents the third level of the divided line. Now, remember I was saying last time that I make a big deal about when someone gains immediate intellectual intuition into these ideas, which are all the things on the surface of the earth represent the ideas. Not ideas with a capital I, ideas with a little I, because they're not ultimate ideas. There's a liberation that takes place in gaining knowledge, okay? So all these things on the surface of the earth, that represents the subject matter of the arts and sciences. And the power that reveals that is dianoia, through mind, which is the mind. And one gains knowledge. But remember, at that third level, there's no questioning of the principles upon which the knowledge is based. Remember I said in biology, there's no questioning what is life. Anthropology, no questioning what it means to be human. History, no questioning what is history. But that's as it should be, because if you're asking what is life, then you're not learning about nerve cells and fat cells and so on, right? So now when you move to the fourth level, that's the sky, that represents the sky in the allegory of the cave, the luminaries in the sky. Those represent the ultimate ideas. Now here's where the transformation takes place. when we gain insight into these ultimate ideas, there's a transformation and a liberation that takes place in the soul of the person. Remember, I told you there's certain things you learn, and you know that when you learn them, uh, when you learn them, you're the same person. But there are other things that when you learn them, you become a different person, a better person. And that's these ultimate ideas, like when you gain insight into what is education, what does it mean to be human, what is justice, what is beauty, what is the sublime, what is truth. So these things transform you. And the way towards that is intellection, or noesis, Noesis, intellectual intuition. And the method for that, for Plato, is dialectic. When you get to the highest level is the sun. And the sun represents the idea of the good. That's connected to that little dot above the line in the divided line. And Plato has Socrates say that your education, or in the context of our course, the elevation of the human soul is not complete until one gains insight into that. So that's the study of theology and mysticism, where one gains an immediate insight into the nature of the ultimate. He doesn't use the word God because he doesn't think that God is a being, but rather the source of all beings. And so he just gives it a metaphor and he calls it the idea of the good. This idea of the good contains all the other ideas in it. And then he comes back down to become the occasion for the liberation of others. So you have these 4 levels of the divided line that correspond to the 4 levels. The surface of the earth, that's level 1, and what's going on in the mind of the prisoners, that's level 1. The raised platform and those men who are carrying things, that's level 2. The surface of the earth and the apprehension of the liberated person, that's level 3. The sky, the illuminators, the illuminations of the sky, level 4, the ultimate ideas, and the sun, the allegory, in the allegory of the cave, represents the idea of the good. The time that the eyes need to acclimate, that just means it takes a long time. At first, it's easier to see the reality of physical things, and it's hard to see metaphysical things. It's harder to see things in the intelligible region than it is to see things in the visible region. But after a while, you begin to learn how to see with your mind's eye. Then, once you have some insight into what is truth, what is knowledge, what is propaganda, what is education, genuine education, where you have an adequate idea that corresponds to these words that we throw around, like education and truth, then when you see an embodiment of that, you know the difference between, say, propaganda and facts, okay? So it's a movement, it's a what comes out in the allegory of the cave that doesn't come out in the divided line is this freedom, this liberation of the soul. So liberation takes place through a transformation of the soul towards wisdom and moral excellence. I haven't been talking too much about moral excellence. We'll talk more about that, but it's a very big idea in Plato, in the dialogues. This journey of the soul towards wisdom is also a journey of the transformation of the soul, as I've been emphasizing. Now, part of this transformation, I told you, has to do with gaining insight into these ultimate ideas, these ideas that are expressing the essence of these ultimate realities. Now, among the ultimate realities, there are moral virtues like wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Those are the 4 cardinal virtues in Plato's philosophy. So Plato has Socrates claim that when you gain insight into what is temperance, what is courage, into the essence of wisdom, and what is justice, then automatically one becomes courageous, temperate, wise, and just. But like I said, he's also speaking in the Republic on a political level too, because On a political level, the ideal state is the soul writ large. Remember, I said that was one of the overarching themes of the Republic. What that means is that if the rulers have gained insight into these cardinal virtues and they themselves become virtuous, then they can assure that the state remains just. They can create laws such that the business class are not greedy, such that the military and the police are courageous and not brutal. Well, the police not being brutal. The military needs to be brutal towards the enemies, of course, but it has to do with keeping peace. And then the rulers, there would be laws and policies in order that the rulers would be wise and virtuous. And then there would be a harmony in the state, just like there's a harmony in the soul of a virtuous person. And that harmony in the state has to do with the different classes of people living in harmony with each other, instead of, as we're living today, at each other's throats and bifurcating everything, everyone at, like the state divided, a house divided will soon fall. Isn't that what Christ said? So you can't have a state that's where people are, it's so partisan that nothing can take place. Then no laws can get passed. It's just stalemate. Okay, so when there's a harmony in the state, that's called justice, when the parts get along. And when there's a harmony in the soul, that's called justice. So these are the highlights of the allegory of the cave. So what I'd like you to get from this is, and this approach is rather original on my part. I'm emphasizing something that not been emphasized, because usually Plato, see, the word evolution is a modern word, and usually you don't find that word spoken of in the context of Plato. In fact, a lot of the resistance against the theory of evolution was from this 2,500 years of Platonism, because for Plato, things are sort of fixed. There's an idea of a giraffe. They didn't get long necks over a period of time, So that part is anti-evolutionary. The fact that these ideas are fixed in Plato. But there's another, and I'm using the word evolution here loosely, there's an evolutionary, and or perhaps I should just use the word developmental and drop the word evolution from talking about Plato. But there's a developmental notion, a dynamic notion of human nature in Plato that's being bypassed by many of the secondary literature on Plato that I can see, that I'm trying to emphasize. And that is that human nature is an evolution or a process. It's a elevation, it's a stages of development towards a transformation and a liberation of the soul towards wisdom and moral excellence. So that's my interpretation of the allegory of the cave. And that's how I would like you to extract from that a theory of human nature, a dynamic and evolutionary theory of human nature based on these two readings, the famous allegory of the cave and the divided line. And it's important to bring these two together. A lot of people separate the two, but the divided line is very helpful in understanding the allegory of the cave. But there's a lot more in the cave than the divided line expresses. If you bring the two together, then you have a more full understanding. So I think that's enough on, if you do those readings, if you read book 6 of Plato's Republic and book 7 of the Republic, if you listen to these 3 lectures that I gave on Plato, I think you'll be able to have your first glimpse into a great philosopher and what he thought human nature is, and what capacities that are inherent in human nature and what human nature can become. Okay, thank you.